Plastics were first created in 1907 by the Belgian-American scientist Leo Hendrik Baekeland, and since they've become a fundamental part of society, from clothing to toys to kitchenware. Our need for plastics means that in 2019, 368 million metric tons of single-use plastics were created, and yet only 9% of plastic is recycled. When most of us hear the phrase plastic pollution, our minds may conjure up images of beer rings wrapped around the necks of aquatic animals, dolphins trapped in fishing nets, or even the burgeoning Pacific garbage patch. However, plastic pollution may pose a much greater, unseen threat against both the global wildlife population and humanity itself. And that threat comes in the form of microplastics. Plastics have been separated into 7 different types to make it more easy for us to recycle them. These 7 types are based on their physical properties, and each of them has a unique identification code. For example, milk bottles are tough and resistant, so they're labelled type 1, whereas cling film is low density and as such is labelled type 4. Each of these types of microplastics can be degraded by a variety of different mechanisms, the most common of which is mechanical stress, for example when your tyres are being worn down by the road. Other examples include UV light from the sun breaking down plastics, and also chemical degradation by corrosive substances. All of these techniques lead to the production of microplastics. And I'm here at the University of Bath to talk to researchers and gain a deeper understanding of microplastics and their effects. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak with us today. I suppose the first question really is, how small does a plastic have to be classified as a microplastic?
So microplastics are any plastic material that are under 5 millimeters. However, in the lab, we work with much smaller sizes. So usually 5 millimeters are easier to separate. The problem is when they become slightly smaller. So we are talking about micrometer size. And in the lab, we sometimes even work with nanometer size, so under 1 micrometer.
Okay. I suppose this is really a bit of a twofold question, but part 1 is, can any sort of plastic be a microplastic? And part 2 is, where do those plastics come from and how do they become microplastics?
So any plastic material under 5 millimeters microplastic, they usually come from 2 different sources. So there are primary microplastics that are those that are already very small when they are fabricated, and then they are used, or they used to be used in cosmetics, for example, creams and so on. However, in Europe, they are now banned, but other parts of the world that they're still using it. And then there is secondary microplastics. Those are plastics materials that were bigger, and then they break into small pieces. For example, jeans when they are washed in the washing machine, they produce some fibers that are also microplastics.
So, microplastics can enter our rivers and our oceans, even from everyday items like our clothes. Take, for example, this litre of water I'm holding here. Now, this one was sourced from the weir behind me, but depending on where else in the country you source this from, it could contain anywhere from 2.5 to 1,000 particles of microplastics. Now, while that might not sound like a lot for one sample, when you consider the fact that there's 47,000 kilometres of rivers in the UK, that makes for an awful lot of microplastics. Of course, if there's plastics in our rivers, there's bound to be plastics in the oceans as well. It's been estimated that there could be anywhere between 15 and 51 trillion pieces of plastic in the ocean. And in the upper levels of the ocean alone, there could be up to 24.4 trillion particles of microplastics. And these plastics can spread from the ocean into the beaches, which are of course an epicenter of human activity. But it's not just our waters that are infected with plastics. They can spread deep within forests and their communities as well. Because of this abundance of plastics in forests, certain animals have started to exploit them. For example, the pied flycatcher is a species of bird that rarely breeds in the UK, and a 2023 study estimated that as much as 35% of their nests could now contain plastics. However, animal dens and nests aren't the only places within forests that you find plastics. It's been estimated that within the soil in forests, there can be anywhere between 160 and 640 particles of microplastics per kilogram. And this can have significant unseen effects on the ecosystem and the organisms within it.
In general, the effects of microplastic in the environment, they are more subtle. So microplastics these are particle sizes that we do not see with a blank eye. But then if we look, for example, on a beach, then we could basically find these particles in the beach sand, also in sediments, in rivers, or in soils as well. In the first place, microplastics, they may interact with the organisms that ingest them. So they may interact with their digestion system, for example. So that is one important aspect. Similar what we, for example, see also with birds that take up microplastics, and then basically it fills up their stomach, but they're not digestible, and then it blocks the digestion system. The other effect that we have is that basically microplastics, they may absorb other types of pollutants. So, for example, we can have harmful chemicals that can absorb, and thereby the microplastic itself can lead to easier transport of such contaminants in the environments, and then also lead to a contamination of whole ecosystems, for example. And also they can be basically a surface where harmful pathogens can grow on them. So we have shown this in our research that pathogenic bacteria, they grow on microplastics, and then they can spread into rivers because the lighter microplastic floats and can then transport these pathogens, for example, and then infect local fish.
However, pathogens aren't the only things that can attach to microplastics. They can be a host for a wide range of different substances. These substances can have potentially deadly effects on the environment. There's no better example of this than in rivers, but not rivers here in Bath, rivers across the pond in the United States. As mentioned earlier, when tyres wear on roads, they can create microplastics, and these microplastics can carry toxic chemicals. One example of which is a chemical called 6-PDD, which is one of the most toxic chemicals to aquatic organisms in the world. When rain falls, it can create toxic runoff from the roads, which in turn flows into rivers. And within 24 hours of rainfall, it can kill up to 90% of salmon within a given region. In nature, it's not only birds and fish that can be negatively affected by microplastics. All organisms are connected by the food chain, but this can hide a hidden negative effect known as biomagnification. Biomagnification occurs when microplastics are accumulated by organisms lower down the food chain, such as plankton or food crops. As these organisms are consumed by organisms higher up the food chain, the concentration of microplastics increases, and this is an effect that's seen at every level of the food chain. As we get to organisms at the very top of the food chain, such as birds of prey or humans, the concentration of microplastics can be greatly increased. And as microplastics can carry toxins such as pesticides or mercury, this could lead to serious health effects such as reproductive failure, neurological damage, or even death. For example, in lobsters, we see body mass loss and fat metabolism dysregulation. In mussels, we have observed inflammation and damage to digestive cells. Earthworms have displayed low growth, DNA damage, and high mortality rates. Fish are even worse hit, with signs of brain and liver damage, intestinal damage, and abnormally risky behavior. Certain birds have shown scarring, inflammation, and loss of structure in the kidney and the spleen. And lastly, rats have displayed altered hormone production, cell death, and sperm abnormality. If these are the effects that microplastics can have on simpler organisms, what are the potential effects that they can have on humans?
Recent research has shown that the small microplastic particles can be found in human tissue, and there has been some relationships now with immune system health and also with the reproductive health of humans. So it may actually explain some reason why the fertility of male humans has been decreasing over the last few decades. That might be one factor, but that area is still an ongoing research area as well, and it is related to also other types of environmental contaminants.
It's thought that on average as humans that we can take up between 1 and 4 microplastics per kilogram of body mass every single day. The two main ways that we take them up is by ingestion, so in our foods and in our drinks, and also by inhaling microplastics that may be floating around in the air. The concern about this is that we don't fully understand the negative effects which they're having on our bodies at the moment, as it's such a new area of research. However, it is coming to light some of the negative effects that they could be having in recent studies. For example, they can affect our lungs by causing inflammation and DNA damage. They can have an effect on the heart and cause abnormal rhythms. And most importantly, they can affect the central nervous system, and this could lead to further problems down the line, including memory loss. However, it's not all doom and gloom, and there's plenty of research going on here at the University of Bath on how microplastics can be removed from our food and water and create a better future for everybody. So you've researched into how to remove microplastics from the water. Do you think you could explain a little bit of the methodology involved there?
So in our lab, we focus on removing the microplastics that are already in the environment, and we have been trying to use different technologies. One of them is similar to what I use in my PhD, using sunlight or radiation to break the chemical bonds of the plastics. We have been trying to investigate that in the plastics, and the issue with that technology is a little bit slow, so you need long periods to produce changes. But it is very interesting because the resource of energy, the radiation, if it comes from the sun, is free, so it's an interesting alternative. We use more energetic technologies, for example, pyrolysis, so trying to increase the temperature of the plastic in absence of oxygen. And we use that to remove the plastic. It is more effective, and then some of the products of the reaction can be useful. So for example, you can obtain some precursors to fabricate the plastic again, or hydrocarbons that can be used as a fuel. Another research that we have been doing in the lab is more focused on separation rather than removal, and it was trying to use electrocoagulation. So we were using electrodes to try to help the particles to become bigger, and as they are bigger, then they can deposit at the bottom. So it is easier to separate from the water, the clean water, from a little bit of water that has more plastics, higher concentration of plastics.
Obviously, it's important to remove microplastics from the environment, but obviously it's also important not to put more in, so is there any alternatives to microplastics that are being developed?
Yes, so finding ways to avoid the microplastics to be incorporated in the environment is also very important. And in the department, for example, one of my colleagues, Professor David Matia, he has been doing research on trying to substitute microplastics for cosmetics, for example, by cellulose beads. So they use still small particles, but they are not microplastics. They are easy to remove in the future.
Whilst this research may be on a smaller scale, Dr. Jannis Wenk is researching removal at the level of water treatment plants. So in your papers, you've discussed how water treatment plants and constructed wetlands can be used to remove microplastics from the environment. Do you think you could just discuss that in a little more detail?
Wastewater treatment plants, they have been designed to remove nutrients from the wastewater, or also biological oxygen demand, and microplastics are a newer type of pollutant. So wastewater treatment plants have not been designed to remove microplastics per se, but because they also remove other types of solids, they are in fact relatively efficient in removing them. So most of the microplastics in wastewater treatment is basically removed already in the sludge. It may then end up in the sludge. The sludge is treated in one way or the other. If we look at what then microplastics that goes through the wetland, there is still a considerable number. And then in our research, we basically looked at how specifically constructed wetlands can be used, or how basically microplastics interacts with them. Because these constructed wetlands, they are used for polishing wastewater. So they improve the treated water before it is released to the environment. And when we did that study, there wasn't very much around it. So basically we looked at how many microplastics comes in from a normal wastewater treatment plant, and how much then goes out, and how much is basically kept in the constructed wetland. And we could basically show that almost like more than 99% of the microplastic particles are basically under normal operation conditions are retained in the wetland.
We can all get more involved in the reduction of microplastic and plastic pollution on an individual level as well. One of the most important ways we can do this is by reusing already purchased plastic items. One example of this is the plastic containers that come with takeaways. These can be reused again and again for the storage of food after preparing meals, or alternatively you could use it to store household items such as leftover nuts and bolts or change. Alternatively, you could get creative with them and use them in an art project, or send them to school with your children so they can use them there. Of course, not all plastics can be reused, and therefore some will have to be recycled. Most plastics can be recycled at home, and you can tell which ones can be because they'll have this label on them. However, for the plastics that can't be recycled at home, such as biscuit and crisp wrappers, you could take these to your local supermarket, as they'll often have a scheme to recycle them for you. For larger items, such as tyres, you can take these to your local council household recycling centre. A better way to reduce plastic pollution is simply to buy fewer plastic products. In 2021, the average EU citizen produced 36 kilos of plastics just from packaging alone, and this highlights an easy way we can all reduce the amount of plastic we consume. One of the most meaningful ways that we can all help to reduce plastic pollution is by engaging with local volunteering projects ourselves, and this would have the most immediate impact on your own local well-being. There's bound to be a forest, beach or river clean-up project somewhere near you, so you could get in touch with them and volunteer a few hours a month to help clean your local area. And if there isn't a local clean-up group near you, you could even consider starting one yourself. All of these actions that we can all take part in contribute to saving the environment, animals, and most importantly, humans.